Hello to those of you here in the room, those of you joining us on Zoom. Thank you so much for making the time to be here with us tonight. And welcome to the Associates of the Boston Public Library's 100-Year Retroactive Book Award for 1924. My name is Lisa Fagan-Davis, and I'm a member of the Associates Board, and I'm the chair of this evening's event. The Associates is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the treasures of the Boston Public Library through grant-making, outreach, and events such as this evening. By expanding access to these collections, the Associates ensures that present and future generations in Boston and beyond continue to be informed and inspired. The Associates funds critical conservation projects and 9 vital full-time library staff positions to catalog, digitize, conserve, and curate the BPL's rare books, manuscripts, prints, photographs, musical scores, works of art, and other items in its special collections. Beyond books, BPL special collections and archives also shine a light on other aspects of an author's life, including the business of being a writer. Special collections hold several letters written by E.M. Forster, for example, detailing the daily workings of a bookshop. There's also an 1846 letter written by Herman Melville about a, quote, obnoxious review, unquote, of his work, Tippy. Whether it's a rare book or a letter, there are thrilling moments of discovery waiting for you in the BPL special collections. This is a public collection, which means that anyone can make an appointment to access these items in the Special Collections Reading Room up on the 3rd floor. I hope you feel inspired enough by tonight's program to come back during opening hours to see for yourself. Tonight, we'll ask you to listen as our 3 champions make a case that their book is, in fact, the best and most enduring book of 1924. Will it be Forster's A Passage to India, Melville's Billy Budd, or Du Bois' The Gift of Black Folk? Listen carefully, and once you've had a chance to ask some follow-up questions, we'll put it to a vote and see who comes out the winner. I hope you'll enjoy the presentations and discussion and exercise your right to vote here on what we like to call Super Wednesday. Before I introduce our moderator, I need to thank everyone who makes this annual event possible, beginning with the associate staff, in particular Executive Director Louisa Bissett, Development Director Laura Russo, and Communications Specialist Vidisha Agwala. I would also, thank you. I would also like to thank my colleagues on the 100-Year Retroactive Book Award Committee and my fellow Associates Boards members, some of whom are in the audience tonight. I thank them all for their dedication to BPL special collections, their efforts to preserve our history, and the many ways in which they share their love of books and libraries. On behalf of everyone at the Associates, I also want to express our appreciation to Boston Public Library and the Board of Trustees of the Boston Public Library, whose chair, Priscilla, is here tonight, for their continued partnership. Finally, it's important that we acknowledge the library staff and custodial staff who work in collaboration with the Associates to make this event possible. Thank you very much. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our Mistress of Ceremonies, Kennedy Elsey. Kennedy is co-host of the very popular and entertaining morning show program, Carson and Kennedy on Mix 104.1, where they've been making us laugh and cry and challenging our knowledge of pop culture trivia for decades. I have been a listener for a very long time, and I have yet to actually beat Kennedy. Yes. As well as being an ardent supporter of the Associates of the Boston Public Library, Kennedy is involved in many important community organizations and programs, such as Carson and Kennedy's Cool Kids and Your Light is Needed fundraiser. She serves on the board of the Samaritans, helping raise awareness of important mental health issues. She is also, I might add, an extraordinary singer who can really bring the heat to a Fenway performance of the Star-Spangled Banner. We are very honored to have her with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Kennedy to the podium.
That was so nice. Thank you. Thank Thank you all so much. Hi, again, my name is Kennedy. Yes, I introduce Taylor Swift records for a living. But the library has always been something really important to me. My mother instilled in me and my sisters at a very early age how important libraries are. We spent lots of time in the library when I was a young person, and when I moved to Boston and first saw this amazing building, I said, I must be a part of this. And so it took me 12 years, but I did it. And they haven't said no. So here I am at the third year, and I'm so excited to be here. So I want to welcome you to the 100-Year Retroactive Book Award of 1924, hosted by the amazing associates of the Boston Public Library. So I'd like to take you back to 1924. I'm going to talk about some things that happened. I'm going to tell some jokes. I hope you'll laugh. I know, nerds don't laugh much, but let's go. All right, so back in 1924, the United States presidential election occurred. It was a three-way contest, kind of unusual, and Calvin Coolidge, the Republican, won and swept every county in Massachusetts. In other related presidential news, also in 1924, George H.W. Bush was born in Milton. As a resident of Quincy, I say, oh, you birthed one president in Milton? How cute. WBZ-AM began broadcasting from Boston in a studio that was housed in the Hotel Brunswick, a place where Emerson, Longfellow, names you see in the Grand Hall as you walk into the library, once stayed. Now it is 500 Boylston, where beautiful people do Soul Cycle. On December 1st, 1924, the Bruins won the first ever NHL game, played on United States soil, and you guys, this story is so cool. So, they won the game, only 1,300 people showed up. However, because of WBZ-AM doing play-by-play, which was one of the first times you'd ever heard a play-by-play in America, people got to have sports in their lives that never had it before. And the play-by-play guy was a guy by the name of Frank Ryan. Frank Ryan, a Bruins guy till the end, when he was on his deathbed, getting his last rites, Ryan turned to the priest and said, when I get out of here, Father, we're going to the next Bruins game, to which the priest... Right? To which the priest says, keep quiet, Frank, I'm anointing you. Something only true Bruins fans can understand. In 1924, the Boston Marathon course was lengthened to 26 miles, 385 yards to conform to the Olympic standard, and the starting line was moved from Ashland to Hopkinton. And as someone who has run that Boston Marathon, I wish they'd have kept it in Ashland. In 1924, the Olympic Games qualifiers were held at Harvard Stadium. The finalists went on to compete that year in Paris. And the first aerial circumnavigation of the world was completed in 1924 by 4 aviators from an 8-man team. It took them 175 days, almost as long as it took me to finish said Boston Marathon. And both of these photos you see here are from the Boston Public Library's special collections. Also in 1924, Clayton Sonny published Happy Birthday to You, a song we all know, but I don't know if you know the contentious copyright that went along with it. Let me tell you that as a person who works in radio, I would never play that song on air. I know it's public domain now, but I'm just too scared. Also, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin was first performed in New York City. And then in 1976, United Airlines paid $300,000 to use it in their advertising. Something they say, and I quote, our intention was to use it in a way Gershwin, were he still alive, would be pleased. I feel that's not the case. Little Orphan Annie comic strip was first published in the New York Daily News. You now have tomorrow in your head, and I'm sorry. And as I always leave you with the Red Sox from that year, we finished 7th out of 8. Attendance, 8th out of 8. Not much has changed. I love you, boys. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's presenters. First up is Paul B. Armstrong, a professor of English Emeritus at Brown University, the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of A Passage to India. He is the author of several books on modern fiction, literary theory, and neuroaesthetics, which I had to look up, Paulie B. And let me just tell you, it is a word I'm so glad I know now. It's beautiful. If you don't know, look it up. If you don't know, you can pretend like you do. His most recent books are Stories and the Brain, The Neuroscience of Narrative, How Literature Plays with the Brain, The Neuroscience of Reading and Art, and play The Politics of Reading, The Social Uses of the Modernist Forum. He is also the editor of Norton Critical Editions of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's a light book. And E.M. Forster's Howard's End. Paul will defend E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. Please welcome Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And also I want to thank the Associates of Boston Public Library for inviting me to this very unique and interesting event. A Passage to India was an immediate bestseller in England when it first appeared in June 1924. More than a decade had passed since the 1910 publication of Howard's End, the novel that had established E.M. Forster as one of the leading English writers of his day. And this long-awaited new work confirmed and solidified his reputation. A Passage to India is less experimental than novels by Forster's modernist contemporaries, James Joyce, or his Bloomsbury friend, Virginia Woolf, a point in its favor, perhaps, because it's a more accessible and compelling read. But the formal accomplishment of Passage has been admired since its first publication, and perceptive readers have noted over the years that its stylistic innovations are more subtle and complicated than its apparent adherence to the conventions of literary realism might suggest. Although A Passage to India is now widely regarded as a masterpiece in the canon of modern fiction, its initial sales had perhaps less to do with its literary merits than with political controversies roiling India in the 1920s, as Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement and other protests against British rule signaled that independence was not far away. Forster began composing A Passage to India after his first trip to India in 1912-13 to visit his friend Syed Ras Masood, to whom he eventually dedicated the novel. Financed by earnings from Howard's End, this trip came at a time when he was uncertain about what to do next and unclear whether he could continue his career as a novelist. As a closeted gay man who was a teenager in the 1890s, at the time of Oscar Wilde's trial for imprisonment for sodomy and gross decency, Forster felt that the genre's traditional theme of heterosexual romance was increasingly uncongenial. He complained of writer's block in a journal entry from June 1911, and I quote, "Having sat for an hour in vain trying to write a play, will analyze causes of my sterility. 1, inattention to health, curable. 2, weariness of the subject I both can and may treat, the love of men for women, and vice versa." Forster traveled widely during his 6-month stay in India, spending time with Masood and visiting many other Indian and Anglo-Indian friends and acquaintances, and touring major and minor sites, including the town of Bankapur and the Barabar Hills that became the models of Chandrapur and the Marabar Hills in Passage. Forster began writing his Indian novel soon after his return to England in 1913, but broke off composition several months later, apparently unable to imagine his way through the crucial chapters on the Marabar excursion. As he later remembered, "I was clear about the chief characters and the racial tension, had visualized the scenery, and had foreseen that something crucial would happen in the Marabar caves, but I hadn't seen far enough." Forster abandoned this project and turned his attention to Morris, his novel of same-sex love that he completed in 1914 and circulated privately among friends, but did not dare publish during his lifetime. Homosexual acts were criminalized in England and punishable by imprisonment until 1967, and Morris was finally published in 1971, a year after Forster's death. On December 31st, 1914, he wrote in his diary, quote, "Shall never complete another novel," end quote. The manuscript of Passage lay dormant during World War I, which Forster spent as a Red Cross volunteer in Egypt. Although active as a reviewer, he was adrift and apparently unable to launch another creative project when he accepted an invitation from the Maharaja of Bois to return to India in 1921 as a temporary secretary, filling in for another Englishman on sick leave. He took the unfinished pages of the novel with him, but was unable to work on them. And let me quote from his diary. "As soon as they were confronted with the country they purported to describe, they seemed to wilt and go dead, and I could do nothing with them. I used to look at them of an evening in my room at Bois and felt only distaste and despair. The gap between India remembered and India experienced was too wide, end quote. During his 11-month stay, he continued to gather material that would appear in the novel, including his impressions of the Gokul Ashtami festival that became the centerpiece of the temple section, and his attitude toward India became less innocent and romantic. The prolonged, interrupted composition of the novel played a major role in the ambiguity surrounding the timing of events in the story. The decade between 1912 and 1922 was a pivotal period in the rise of the Indian independence movement and the decline of the British Raj. India sent more than 1 million troops to serve in World War I, but the general expectation that this contribution would be rewarded with rapid progress towards self-rule was disappointed, and the momentum of the independence movement accelerated in consequence. The novel seems to allude to some of the decade's crucial events, such as the 1919 Amritsar massacre and the anti-British protests it unleashed, but other important developments, such as Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign, go unmentioned. When exactly to date the events dramatized in A Passage to India is unclear, and deliberately so. As Forster wrote to an early reviewer, and I quote, "The time of the novel is supposed to be a war. Part of my experience was pre, but part post, so I was in a difficulty and tried to eliminate whatever seemed to date," end quote. In a letter to his publisher, Forster noted that he had been careful, he said, not to allude to contemporary politics. The result is a novel that is both intensely topical and yet not tied to specific historical events. As Forster later commented, and I quote, "The book is not really about politics, though it is a political aspect of it that caught the general public and made it sell. It's about something wider than politics, about the search of the human race for a more lasting home, about the universe as embodied in the Indian earth and the Indian sky, about the horror lurking in the Malabar caves and the release symbolized by the birth of Krishna. It is, or rather aspires to be, philosophic and poetic," end quote. The critical reception of the novel reflects this ambiguity, with some critics emphasizing its political dimensions and others reading it as a commentary on philosophical and religious themes. The political implications of the novel are particularly relevant today, I think. A work of much greater epistemological complexity than its seemingly conventional narrative form suggests, A Passage to India invokes the ideal of an impartial, reciprocal knowledge of other peoples and cultures, only to suggest that interpretation invariably requires distancing, partial judgments. The novel insists that truth and justice can be determined unequivocally. Aziz is innocent, and India must be liberated from the yoke of British oppression. But its manipulation of point of view demonstrates the difficulty, perhaps impossibility, of attaining a lasting consensus about any matter. The omniscient narrator of Passage is provocatively contradictory in a way that challenges the reader to become ironic about our own epistemological limitations. The convention of omniscient narration presumes that there's a truth underlying opposing points of view that the narrator, as an all-knowing God, has access to. Forster invokes this privilege in order to question it, as indeed he must if there is nowhere he or we can stand outside of the epistemological and political problems he dramatizes. His narrator is both all-knowing and an eccentric, oddly opinionated commentator who debunks English prejudices about the Indian other, only then himself to deploy questionable generalizations like those he questions, as if to point out that any authority is culture-bound and biased, even the omniscient voice of a third-person narrator. Forster is not exempt from this dilemma, nor is anyone, and figuring out how to deal with it pragmatically and with humility is one of the challenges of our polarized time, where everyone's tribe thinks it has a corner on truth and justice. What Forster wants the reader to learn from these contradictions, I think, is the pragmatic value of irony. Recognizing the limits of our cultural and political perspectives will not overcome them, but learning to be ironic about those limits is useful equipment for living in a world riven with irreconcilable differences. Forster's narrative skill as a teacher of the art of ironic criticism uses rhetorical power to fight the bully wherever we may find him, including in ourselves, and to expose the contingency and blindness of any perspective that claims privileged authority, his as well as ours. Forster believed in personal relations, the intimacies with friends where, as a closeted gay man, he could be himself, and he was suspicious of the power structures that stood in their way. But he was also not naive about the difficulties of realizing the ideal announced by the much-quoted motto to Howard's end, "Only connect." A Passage to India asks whether or no it is possible for an Indian to be friends with an Englishman. And it answers, spoiler alert, no, not yet, no, not there. As the novel shows in its critique of the abuses of imperialism, the path to friendship across barriers of nation, race, sex, and class must first be cleared by doing political work to eliminate institutional structures of oppression. The British Raj must go. But that will not by itself produce conditions of harmony and justice, as is shown by the disputes between Muslims and Hindus in the novel, and later, in Indian history, with the 1947 partition after the dissolution of empire, and even today with the rise of Hindu nationalism and the continuing conflict between India and Pakistan. An ironic recognition of the limitations of any community's beliefs and values will not resolve their differences, but it's a necessary start. A Passage to India is prescient about these dilemmas, and that's a good reason to read it today and to vote for it now, a century later, as the best book of 1924. Thank you.
And that is how you end a speech. Because we will be asking for your vote later, you know that, right? All right, next up, I would love to introduce to you Richard Deming, a poet, a critic, an essayist, the author of 6 books, including Touch of Evil, Day for Night, An Art of the Ordinary, and the newest book is This Exquisite Loneliness, which I started reading today. Guys, he teaches at Yale University, where he is the director of creative writing, and Richard will defend Herman Melville's Billy Budd. Please give it up for Richard.
Dearly beloved, sorry, podiums have that effect on me. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. The Boston Public Library is a huge force in my life, and so it's nice to be able to give back. And the organizers said, keep it light, something humorous. So let me tell you about a novel about an execution of an innocent man by Herman Melville, who was walking on the sand dunes with Nathaniel Hawthorne one day and said he'd pretty much made up his mind to be annihilated, which sounds like a good time. I mean, I think Melville is probably the only person that can make Nathaniel Hawthorne go, wow, that guy's intense. You're a good crowd, I like this. So let me begin by saying something about why we're talking about Billy Budd, which was, Melville dies in 1891, so how did we talk about Billy Budd in 1924? So the thing is about Melville, which you have to remember, is that he had a good start. He was an early comer. Taipei, which was mentioned earlier in the introduction, was a big hit. Omu, he had a good run. He was sort of like a John Krakauer. He was like sort of an adventurer, rugged, handsome guy who would talk about going out on boats and then jumping off and having dalliances with islanders. And so he did really, really well. And then in 1850, he meets Hawthorne, and they have a very brooding walk in the Berkshires, and Melville decides that he's going to rewrite the work that he's working on, and it becomes Moby Dick, the book that we all know, which is dark and brooding and intense and philosophical and one of the greatest books ever written. And it tanks. It does really, really badly. And so he sells almost nothing, and he says, okay, I know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to write a book about murder and incest, and I'm going to make up a philosopher that's going to have this really intricate philosophy, because that's what will bring the fans back. It didn't work, and so he tries a few other books, and then he becomes a poet, which is, as I can attest, is a certain path to obscurity and poverty. which is basically how he dies. And in his last years, he's still working, but it's kind of like for himself. And one of the books that he writes, or the manuscripts that he writes, is Billy Budd. And he starts on it in 1886. He dies in 1891, and he's still tinkering with it, so it's not really complete. And there was a biographer, Raymond Weaver, who in 1921 writes the first biography of Herman Melville called Mariner and Mystic. And it's part of this resurgence in interest that the modernists are finding Moby Dick and saying, oh, wait, this is the greatest book ever written. And now what else has he written? And so Weaver finds it amongst his papers. Melville's daughter gives him like a whole stack and says, you can use any of this. And he finds this manuscript. And it takes a few years, and he kind of figures out how it should be. It's kind of an unfinished work, but they figured out what it really should be. And so they bring it out in 1924, and it really is a hit. I mean, this is the time that Melville is really being rediscovered, and ever since it's been made into an opera by Benjamin Britten with the libretto by E.M. Forster. I'm just saying Forster wrote about Melville. Melville didn't write about Forster, so if you're voting, oh yeah, I'm here. No less than Thomas Mann said he wished he had written it. Camus wrote about it. I mean, all the cool kids were writing about it. And some say it's enduring values because it's a novel about evil and good. But I say it's much more complicated than that, and that's why it lives on. So, what is this book that some of you haven't read, and someone said I read it when I was 16? So let me refresh your memory. The year is 1797. That's when Billy Budd is set. And England is at war with France. Billy Budd is a stunningly beautiful young man. And it's really important that we highlight that because Melville does. He's feminine, he's beautiful, he's really someone that everybody wants to be around until he gets to the situation that he's in. He is on a merchant marine ship called the Rights of Man, and he's pulled from that because he's such a young, strapping guy, pressed into service on the ship, the Bellipotent, whose captain is Captain Beer. On his old ship, Billy had been much beloved. He's sweet, he's naive, desperately naive, he's compliant. Everybody wants to be around him. People love Billy so much that even when he gets onto a warship, they do his laundry for him. That's how sexy this guy is. He's a little clumsy, he's a bit inept, but they all love him. He has one flaw, one difficulty, which is he has an extreme stutter that, as happens, the more upset, the more nervous, the more emotional he gets, the harder it is for him to communicate. Now, even on a warship, he should have a good time of it. But on the ship is one John Claggart. He's our antagonist. He is the evil one. Everybody else likes Billy except Claggart. Claggart has a really deep ambivalence. He's attracted to, I mean, it's a gay novel. Let's just be clear about it, all right? He really, really likes Billy, as everybody else does, but he also has this ambivalence. So how does he work it out? He does it by being really mean, especially mean to Billy, and gives him extra work to do and is kind of hard on him. Billy is so naive that he sees it as Claggart giving him more and more opportunities to shine, to show how good and how talented and how capable he is, and everybody else is like, Billy, this guy hates you. Every time he says you're doing a good job, he's being sarcastic. Billy doesn't get that, and so that kind of bothers Claggart too. And so Claggart sets Billy up. And this is really important because in the time period, mutiny, and especially at war, mutiny is a very serious threat that is in fact a capital offense. And the captains of ships are basically deputized to have a court of law on the ship if there is a mutiny, and to take out the offending parties, to put it, diplomatically. So Claggart gets the idea. he gets one of his henchmen to go in the middle of the night to say into Billy's ear, hey, I want you to come meet me and we'll talk about mutinying because we got to take this ship over. And Billy's like, yeah, that's kind of weird. He doesn't go, by the way. But he does the next day walk by the guy, and the guy plays it off like he didn't do anything. So it's a little Mean Girls kind of thing. So you're still a good crowd. I like this. So what happens is that Claggart decides to go right to Captain Beer and say, look, Billy is plotting this mutiny. You have to do something. And Beer's like, I don't really believe that. He's a nice kid. He does a lot. I mean, everybody does his laundry, but he shows up on time. He's pretty. Beer also is attracted to him. That is also important. And so he says, in the presence of Claggart, he says, Billy, listen, you're being accused of mutiny, and of course that's, or conspiring to mutiny, and of course that's a capital offense. What do you say about this? And Claggart is here, and he's your superior, he's a reputable man, we believe him, but we don't believe him, what is happening? And Billy gets so upset that he can't speak. The more upset and frustrated he can't speak. And so he just kind of lashes out, and he hits Claggart and kills him. Accidentally, he just strikes out. He's like, broing out, and he drops Claggart. And so now this is the core of the novel. That Veer is in an unwinnable situation. He knows that Billy didn't mean to do this. He knows that in his heart, Billy is a good guy. He, in fact, is pretty sure that Claggart wasn't telling the truth about this. But because of the wartime situation, because of the threat of mutiny, he feels that he has really no choice, that the state works through him, that the military, that he is simply a cog in the machine of the military. And if he is merciful here, then it opens the door for everyone else to be to get away with, well, murder, I guess, no pun intended, or pun intended, manslaughter in this case. Anyway, I'm moving ahead. And I think that this really is where the problem is. There is a drumhead court, Captain Beer is the prosecuting attorney, and he basically rigs it so that, he is the captain, what are you gonna say, no? And he rigs it so that Billy is charged with killing, he really did kill Claggart. And so he is condemned, and he does hang on board the ship. And there is this Christ-like image of him being hoisted up and then let go, and he dies, and his dying words are, God bless Captain Beer. So what is the complexity, this is the less jokey part, what is the complexity of Billy Budd? Why does it endure? It is the complexity of one's sense of duty to law. I think this is why it's so important that Melville doesn't answer the question of should Veer have done this, should he not have, right? He brings the problem to light. And this is the question, where do law, duty, justice, morality, ethics part ways? Where should they? Where must they part ways? The story doesn't lead us to a specific resolution. Melville's tendencies tend not towards answers, but the questions that keep reverberating throughout the choices that we make. Morality may not be about adhering to laws and rules and guidelines. It may be difficulties of navigating towards the good and towards right action in the most fraught circumstances is what this book wrestles with. Ultimately, Billy Budd is a novella about how is responsible, not only responsible for our responses, but to them as well. Veer dies with Billy Budd's name on his lips. And at the end of the novel, what we have is contrasting examples of the story. It's retold as, we have the main story, then it's retold as a kind of story in a newspaper, and then a poem. Which form is the real one? It depends on who you ask. And it depends on how you ask the question. And ultimately, that's what we need more of, questions. Vote Melville.
Is it Krieger? The guy? Krieger? Am I saying that? Clegg. I just know I dated him once in my life. I know I did. Thank you, Richard. That was awesome. All right, next up and final tonight, I would love to introduce you to Paula C. Austin, a U.S. historian with a focus on the history of race, racism, urban and women's history, history of social science, and the history of childhood. Paula is currently the Associate Professor of History and African American Black Diaspora Studies and Director of Graduate Studies at Boston University. Diaspora, I say it wrong every time. Her book, you ever have a word that you're gonna say it wrong? You know how to say it right, but you're always gonna say it wrong? Say yes, make me feel better. Thank you. Her book, Coming of Age in Jim Crow, DC, Navigating the Politics of Everyday Life, is a social and intellectual history of poor and working class young Black people. She is currently working on a history of police violence and police reform in Washington, DC, and Paula will defend W.E.B. Du Bois' The Gift of Black Folk. Please, please, please welcome Paula.
That's my word, yeah. Inchoate, I think that's my word. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I am really grateful to have been included in this, to have been asked by the associates to present on W.E.B. Du Bois's The Gift of Black Folk, to advocate for it, I guess is what I'm supposed to be doing. Thank you for setting the stage of 1924. I'm going to set a different 1924 stage. I'm sorry. It was a leap year. I'll start with that. It was a leap year like 2024. But some other things are fascists win the election in Italy. Native Americans get citizenship in their own homeland, this country, with the Indian Citizenship Act. The KKK gets its 5 millionth, wrap your heads around that, 5 millionth member. I mean, are there even 5 million people in the US? I don't even know. Somebody needs to do, but there were 5 million, they get the 5 millionth in 1924. And eugenics is not only mainstream, but it is considered cutting edge science in 1924. And eugenicists are legit giving expert testimony to Congress as Congress is working on the 1924 Immigration Act, the Johnson-Reed immigration law that severely limited Asian, Southern, Eastern European immigrants. And while the Mexican border remained open because of labor, we do get the first US federal border patrol in 1924. So that's just, I'm sorry, there's some other things. Other stuff too. Anyway, who was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois? He's a local guy. I mean, Great Barrington is not local, I'm sorry, but he was born in Great Barrington. He was a Harvard-trained historian. He's also a trained sociologist. He helped to found and then led for many decades the NAACP. He was the editor of their press organ, the Crisis magazine. We often think about him in this early 20th century moment of the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement. But Du Bois lived until the mid-1960s. He died in 1963 or 1964. The U.S. government revokes his passport during, our infamous, notorious anti-communist repressive era. And when the U.S. refused to renew his passport, Du Bois became a Ghanaian citizen. He actually dies in Ghana, where he had been living for several years already. So, the gift of Black folk. I think most folks know Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks, which comes out in 1902 or 1903. But this is just one gift. It is the gift of Black folk. I thought the singularness of that was kind of interesting. So it's less known. It comes out in 1924. By 1928, it's out of print. Maybe that tells us something about who was interested in reading it. But it is then reprinted 4 times between 1968 and 1975.
And 2 of those times it is completely like republished. It's got new intro, one by Commonwealth native writer and civil rights activist Truman Nelson, who also, I don't know if folks know him, but he also wrote a really important introductory essay to Robert F. Williams' Negroes with Guns, which was published in 1957. And if you don't know who Williams is, you should definitely find out. The book is actually commissioned. I mean, he spent a long time putting Souls of Black Folks together, but the gift of Black folk is kind of thrown together. It's actually commissioned by the Knights of Columbus, and I'm happy to talk more about why the Knights of Columbus has a series called Racial Contributions to the U.S. in 1924. We can talk more about that. So the Knights of Columbus commissioned this book. Du Bois kind of throws it together, but come on, he's Du Bois. Like, I mean, anything he throws together is going to be better than like what 98% of us in this room could put together in that amount of time. Because he's Du Bois. So the book asks the question, who made America? And Du Bois answers it this way. It was the Black man that raised a vision of democracy in America such as neither Americans nor Europeans conceived in the 18th century, and such as they have not even accepted in the 20th. The book has 9 chapters. He's got a chapter on Black explorers, of course, and in the chapter he really decentralizes the US and I think lays an important foundation for folks in the field of history in the 20th and 21st century. I'm thinking about my colleague John Thornton's work on West and Central Africa, Herman Bennett's work on colonial Afro-Mexico. He's got your requisite chapter on Black soldiering. You got to write about Black soldiering. And in it he says, the Negro fought in every American war for a cause that was not his, and to gain for others a freedom which was not his own. And I will say, one of the most enjoyable things in the book is all the snark, the sarcasm, the side-eye, because I think, he is writing for a predominantly white, I think a nativist, a politically nativist white audience at the time. I mean, I think that's who Knights of Columbus is kind of marketing their series to. So I think he has all of these moments where he has some disdain for the readers. He has a chapter on Black labor. He's also got a chapter on the reconstruction of freedom, and I think both of these chapters are really, for anybody who's read his 1930s tome, Black Reconstruction, a lot of what we get in Black Reconstruction, he's kind of playing around with in these 2 chapters, the Black labor chapter and the reconstruction of freedom. In the Black labor chapter, he says, the gift of brawn and brain, brawn being one of the most important gifts, both in the physically building the country, but also in all of the menial work and the providing the necessary housekeeping and family care that allowed many elites to build wealth in the US. And he says, let us think of the enslaved as a laborer, as one who furnished the original great labor force of the New World and differed from modern labor in only a few small ways. Here's one of these moments. In only a few small ways. Do you want to guess what these small ways are? Wages received. The political and civil rights enjoyed. Okay, second small way. And the third small way, cultural surroundings from which he was taken. All right. So it's moments like these where, you can hear a little bit of a tone in there. In the Reconstruction of Freedom chapter, he describes, quote, how the Black fugitive, soldier, and freedman helped restore the Union, establish public schools, enfranchise poor whites, and initiate democracy in America. So this chapter really disabuses readers of the false narrative of Black incompetence and corruption as the reasons for Reconstruction's failure. And of course, Du Bois identifies these really significant areas of Black contribution by, quote, freedmen in politics, democratic government being the biggest one, free public schools, and new social legislation. And in another snarky twist in that chapter, he identifies the ways that Black suffrage and demands for economic justice have actually opened doors, but not in the way you think. He says, to voting and to jobs, open doors to voting and to jobs for white, poor, and working class people, but not in the way that we would expect. He says, the Negro's agitation for the right to vote has made every step toward disfranchising poor whites unthinkable, for the white vote is needed to help disfranchise black voters. And the black man is pounding open the doors of exclusive trade guilds. And in that way, how can unions exclude white men when black competition could easily break a strike? In his chapter on the freedom of womanhood, he identifies black women as the protagonist in the fight for an economically independent womanhood. And in that chapter, he really, casts some aspersions on the very problematic Victorian ideas about women's place in modern society. Now, I would be remiss if I did not address some of the rhetorical and ideological problems with the text. I mean, come on, it's 1924. And these are things, sadly, that Du Bois kind of reinscribes and reifies. The two chapters where a lot of this is happening, one is his chapter on religion, and I will just say that Du Bois had quit religion generally. He was not a fan of black churches, of the black church. He was not a fan of organized religion. So it was not surprising that this would be one of the chapters where he does not have the best things to say. But interestingly enough, even in that chapter, what he's trying to do is address the pervasive stereotype and accusations of black laziness. And it's in that chapter where he's essentially talking about ways in which black workers balance work and life with a kind of approach to work as a, quote, necessary toil ministering to the pleasure of life. So I was like, great, it's a work-life balance chapter, but he could have done it better. In his chapter on women, he chooses to write about the pervasiveness of white men's sexual exploitation, assault, violence, and abuse of black women as concubinage. And I was like, Du Bois, this is not, don't do that. That's not a good look. Do not. That's a mistake. So, in this way, we get a view of the ways in which Du Bois has internalized and then deploys these kind of pervasive ideas, gender hierarchies, structural racism, heterosexism. I mean, but it's Du Bois. He is the same father who 4 years later is going to encourage his daughter to marry a gay man, County Cullen, and then he's going to pressure her to stay in that marriage, and then when she divorces County Cullen, she does not annul the marriage because she doesn't want to out County Cullen. It's the height of the Harlem Renaissance, and everybody loves County. She decides to not annul the marriage, even though they have not had sex. She divorces him, and Du Bois is mad because, yeah. Anyway, I think they don't speak or something after. They don't have a great relationship anyway after that. So I will end by giving us some parting words from Du Bois. First, I'll say the goal of the gift is really to make clear the ways in which there has been and continues to be a long and constant struggle to expand the practices and policies of the ideological democratic society of the founding. So that is really what the gift is trying to do. Making clear that black people, in spite of and despite of their position as minoritized, terrorized, marginalized, oppressed, have worked in multifaceted ways to open up democracy, to make it real, to make it fully functional. And Du Bois reminds us, quote, the democracy established in America in the 18th century was not, and was not designed to be, a democracy of the masses. And it was thus singularly easy for people to fail to see the incongruity of democracy and an institution like slavery. It was the Negro himself, Du Bois says, who forced consideration of this incongruity, who made emancipation inevitable and made the modern world at least consider, if not wholly accept, the idea of democracy, including people of all races and colors. Black people, he says, forced a more all-embracing democracy. And finally, Du Bois warns, he cautions, he admonishes us not to, quote, forget the humble builders. This is real democracy, he says, not the vain and eternal striving to regard the world as the abiding place of exceptional genius with great wastes of hereditary idiots. Thank you.
Snark and side-eye, words we have never heard here in the 100-Year Retroactive Book Awards. You guys, please give it up for our friends here today, Paul, Richard, and Paula. So now on to the debate. Which is the best book of 1924? No? Nothing? Yo, that's why you came here. So right now, we're going to take questions. So if you have questions in the audience, we would love to take them. Please raise your hand. We will come around with a microphone for you to use. If you are in the virtual world, just use the Q&A button. Your questions will be read here in the room for everyone to hear. And while we're taking the questions, if you want to go on ahead and use that QR code or the instructions that are in your program to place your vote, this is, again, why we're here. If anyone has questions, we would love it. Yes, girl, yes.
Thank you all so much. I have a question for Paula. So the fact that The Gift of Black Folk was actually commissioned by the Knights of Columbus, that's kind of a plot twist, unexpected. Can you dig into that a little bit? I'm curious, was the book he gave them the book they wanted?
So as far as I know, yes. And the Knights of Columbus had a historical commission that essentially in the 1920s was working to combat the pervasive anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic sentiment in the country. So that is the nativist position. And they are commissioning these books that are trying to tell a different kind of story about Black people, about immigrants. And I think it was, yes, I think it was the book that they wanted. The chair of the Historical Commission of the Knights of Columbus writes the introduction for that first edition, where he talks about why it is an important contribution. And it is part of their racial contributions series. Impact, though, I can't speak to. I have no idea what impact any of the books in that series had on the country. I mean, yeah, it's out of print by 28, so, and we get that immigration policy, so no impact, maybe.
Thank you, Lisa. Does anyone else have a question?
I'm going to follow up on that. Of the books that the Knights of Columbus commissioned, is this the only one that endured that people would still be talking about today?
That is a great question. I don't know that I can answer it. It's the only one that was, it's the only author that was familiar to me. And I did not go down any rabbit holes to figure out what had happened to those other folks.
Hi, this is a question for Paul. So how common was it for British young men, British writers to travel to India at this time? Like, there's obviously Vanity Fair, but was this a common coming of age thing, or was this pretty rare?
There was a whole occupational possibility for people that got a certain score in the civil service to go and as a young man and work in India. So it was an employment opportunity. In fact, Forster's good friend Leonard Woolf, who married Virginia Woolf, they were friends in Cambridge. Began his career as an administrator in what was Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, as part of this, the civil service in the Indian Empire. Forster was filling in for someone who was on sick leave in that position, and as with Leonard Woolf, so Forster, when he came back, having seen what was happening with Empire, became a critic. With firsthand knowledge of what was wrong, and Leonard Woolf was one of the most important critics of imperialism for the Labour Party, made his career working against the abuses that he'd seen and witnessed and participated in as a young man, and was someone who really advocated for Forster to finish this novel, get it out there, and he really encouraged him to publish it. Oddly, one last thing, Leonard Woolf was one of the first reviewers of A Passage to India, and what he praised it for was its form. And other reviewers at the time said, Leonard, you got it wrong. What really matters with this book is that it's calling out the abuses of the Anglo-Indians, and it's a really powerful document for pointing out what's wrong with empire and why the Raj has to go.
So the question for Richard. So to what extent was the editor responsible for the final version of Billy Budd?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there was, what was the question? The question was, what role did the editor, to what extent did the editor impact Billy Budd, the final version that we get? So there have been various versions, and really the one that kind of locks in is 1962, and really, they're trying to really figure out his handwriting and his wife's handwriting, because she was his amanuensis, and she wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to include certain parts, but really ultimately it's really the kinds of things that they want to include. It's not, I don't think it's really as contested as sometimes people like to make out. I mean, I've looked at the different versions, and there are different names, and there's the inclusion of a long thing that is kind of boring about Admiral Nelson that could have been left out, and maybe he had wanted to leave it out. And there was some flipping of the names, but really it's a really pretty tight thing that so I wouldn't overstate what the editor did, and the various editors would probably have a conniption about that. But not a huge.
I'm interested in what other books were published in 1924, in that two of the authors we're considering today are really not authors that I would associate with that particular time. Does anyone know what the #1 bestseller in 1924 was?
So one thing I didn't look up. Where's the Google?
I'm kind of interested in the context in which these three books are being presented to us. That was all.
I feel like that's a question not for our panelists, but for the people who chose them.
Committee discussing, trying to remember what the other contenders are. I can't remember, but I will email you. I have your email address, so I will email you. Oh, right, of course.
Winnie the Pooh was one you were thinking of.
Did you think about Magic Mountain? Was Magic Mountain considered? Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain? Great book.
I see a nod. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
If
interesting.
you're here tonight, you will be given, you'll be on our mailing list, so next year you'll be able to do the primary in the fall.
Your very own Super Tuesday, friends. All right, we have a question from our virtual audience.
Passage to India. Can you speak about the characters of Mr. Aziz and Mrs. Moore? What do they symbolize in the novel?
Well.
On the back of a business card, if you don't mind.
That sounds like somebody's writing a midterm.
This is a novel that welcomes interpretation. And so I'm not going to say, this is what to think about Aziz, and this is what to think about Mrs. Moore. I think the friendship between Aziz and Mrs. Moore is really what's very, very interesting. Because Aziz feels that Mrs. Moore has a kind of intuitive appreciation for his religion, his personality, his being, in a way that makes her not what he thinks of an Englishman to be. And so it's an instance where his own prejudices about the other are surprised and overcome, and gives you a sense that you can know someone else. And I think that's one of the things that's really important about the experience that they have meeting each other in the mosque at the beginning. As things transpire, Aziz comes to feel bitter about the way that he's treated and makes this particular interesting moment at the beginning no longer accessible to him, even at the end. And Mrs. Moore becomes disillusioned too and leaves for England, but she remains as a kind of ghost figure that sort of hovers over the Indian landscape and becomes a kind of figure that is embraced by the crowd that celebrates Aziz's vindication as a kind of symbol of someone, a symbol of right and justice, because she doesn't appear at the trial because she's gone, and everybody says she doesn't appear on the trial because the Brits are trying to keep the truth away. So the complicated relationship between the two of them and what they come to symbolize for each other is what really, I think, matters, and it's open for, and it raises lots of different questions about this question that the novel begins with, whether it's possible for people to be friends with one another across cultural and lines like this. And interestingly, it answers yes, but maybe, but no, but it's complicated. And rather than telling you this is what they mean and that's what they mean, and what the book wants you to do is to think about all of the difficulties of people trying to overcome limitations that they're trapped in, that the two characters' relationship with each other dramatizes.
Yes, no, maybe. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Story of my life. Does anybody else have a question? We have some more virtual questions, please.
Were the queer themes of Billy Budd acknowledged at the time of its publication?
Oh, no. No. I mean, there's a...
Say what you really mean, though.
It's funny if you just like go through the history of the reception of it. Like, weirdly, it happens to Whitman too. Like, people bend over backwards to not say gay, and you know, it's still kind of early figuring out the lexicon of it, and Melville himself had some pretty complicated, but you know, 1924, it was pretty early to be able to bring that out, but now, honey, we're all over that.
Our friends virtually are showing you all up, just FYI.
On Passage to India, what was the reception in India, and what is the view of the book in today's India, if we know?
Okay, very good question. I refer you to this wonderful book that has a section on contemporary responses. And there were some complaints among Indian readers at the time that Forster got various things wrong. But even the people that felt that he got this or that or the other detail wrong felt that the book was an important, making an important point about the cause of Indian independence. The later reception of the novel, it's gone through various stages of being popular because it was formally excellent, being trashed because it was a British novel about India and the Brits can't understand India. I think it's been enjoying a kind of revival, in part because of Forster's being recognized as a gay writer, and a sense that being a gay writer gave him an understanding of the ways that oppression worked on personal relations, that meant that this current generation of writers who are interested in queer Forster, including Indian writers writing about the novel's form, have recognized some of the epistemological complications that I'm talking about. And so the novel is having, I think, a resurgence. I taught it my last semester teaching at Brown, and one of the students said, an Indian student said that her father thought it was a great book. So.
All right, very good. In the front row?
This one's for Paula. So The Souls of Black Folk has won this award before, I think very well deserved. A lot of my favorite books probably wouldn't exist without that book. So I'm curious about whether you feel that The Gift of Black Folks has the same kind of reverberations, if it also meets the same level, even if it was thrown together and has these issues, if it impacted other novels in that same way.
So, I mean, I feel like my answer is, I hope you've voted on, if you were going to vote for Du Bois, I hope you voted for Du Bois already. Because I think, I mean, the one thing I will say is that it's a history book in a way that The Souls of Black Folk is not. The Souls of Black Folk, I think, is much more of a kind of, it's much more in a literary genre, although I think it has some history in it. It has some sociology in it. I mean, he's trained in both of those things. But The Gift of Black Folk is definitely a history book. It's a seriously accessible history book because he is writing for a certain audience. And I think he is revising the history that we know about the US in 1924 at a moment when, you know, the kind of biggest history program at Columbia is really writing bad history, is making wrong and bad history. So he's doing something in the field at a moment when not many people are writing a history like this. We don't get a lot of that revisionist history about Black history until the 1950s and 60s. So, so it's important what he's doing, but I think for the audience that it was meant for, I'm not sure that it had significant impact. And I don't think it's one of his more well-known books. So I hope you already voted for him.
I kind of just love that you came at him a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was really interesting in my 3-year tenure of watching these things to see that sort of juxtaposition. So no favoritism. Just saying, you already voted. Do we have a winner? Do I need a moment? Oh, we have a winner. You guys. Again, can you please give it up for our good friends here coming out tonight, far and near, to talk about books that maybe you have never read, or that you read in high school and you forgot about, and now you're going to go home and read them, or look up the books that these amazing human beings have written and go read those as well. Support our local folk. So have a winner. Are you ready? Who you think's going to win?
Whew.
I know you guys are so loud. I can't stand it. I wish you'd be quiet. All right, you guys. So the winner of tonight is Billy Budd by Herman Melville. Honey, we're here. Congratulations.
Well done.
Stand up. Take a bow.
It's a gift card to the Harvard Bookstore.
Congratulations. I love that you want a gift card to the Harvard Bookstore. It's the best gift ever. All right, I'm out of here. My name is Kennedy. Again, thank you guys so much for allowing me to be a part of this evening. It really, I get to do a lot of cool things in my life, but this means more to me than you'll ever know. Lisa, the floor is yours.
All right, one more time. Kennedy, Paula, Paul, and Richard, thank you all so much. And thank you, and congratulations to Herman Melville. Way to go. To our virtual audience, thank you for joining us remotely. For those of you who are here, thank you again for coming, and enjoy your evening.